warlords had not been employed initially by the Karzai government, do you think there would have been any kind of substantial changes on how the events panned out? Or do you think they would have still had the same kind of power that they hold today?
Well, the Karzai government didn't employ the warlords. The Karzai government was made up of warlords.
Correct.
With Karzai playing, I think, in the early stages, a more distinct role. I don't think he was so. I mean, from what I was being told by Afghans, they had some hope for Karzai, the individual, even though he was surrounded himself with warlords, essentially, that had been paid for by the U.S. to fight the Taliban. So, if you're asking, could there have been an option? The option, there was a moment. Sunil might know this better than I did. There was a moment after the Afghan war started, where the Taliban went about 40 miles north of Kabul and set up their lines. And Northern Alliance set up their lines, I think about 10, 15 miles from there. And there was a bit of a standoff because the Taliban were too strong for the Northern Alliance to break through the lines. And the Northern Alliance was asking the Americans to come bomb the Taliban lines. And for about a week and a half or 2 weeks, the US didn't bomb the Taliban. And apparently what was going on is there was a big debate going on, do we really want to let the Northern Alliance come and take over Afghanistan? Because they hadn't worked any of this out, what would be the next leadership. And they waited a week and a half, 2 weeks, and they finally decided, well, that's the best option, because any other option might require either American troops on the ground or some other kind of regional solution. So then they bomb the Taliban lines and the warlords come in. So from the very beginning, the Karzai government was made up of this alliance of warlords.
Do you think there was any kind of option to move forward without the warlords, though?
Most of you know I used to produce this show, Counterspin, and we had this debate on Counterspin. And again, I'm once removed because I'm reporting on what other people say, or I don't get a chance to do this directly too often. But what they were saying at the time, and this was an Afghan member of Human Rights Watch and another Afghan who was a member of another NGO. They were saying I believe there was a conference in Italy, I think it was, when they developed the concept of the Karzai government. And they were saying right at that time they could have disenfranchised the warlords. The war was over, but they could have created a structure that kept the warlords out of the government, out of the cabinet. And then they could have, with great wide Afghan popular support, disarmed the warlords, mostly just by hiring their soldiers away from them. It all goes back to the same issue. Like, you have to decide what's your real objective. If your real objective was democracy in Afghanistan and development for Afghanistan, I think there were a whole set of options. That was never the objective. The objective was either have some ongoing low-level war and/or just leave a situation that won't hurt us. I mean, something that's quasi-pro-American, and forget about it. And then move on to the next, which was Iraq. So I think there really were options then. Now it's obviously far more complicated.
Is Al-Qaeda still there, or is that propaganda?
Well, if you notice any of us mention Al-Qaeda?
Yeah, you did once.
No, I would.
They're an irrelevant force there. I mean, they were an irrelevant force actually during the Soviet period, because they actually came in right at the tail end of the war. And interestingly, one of the jobs I had was to deal with Al-Qaeda as they weren't Al-Qaeda at that time, right, per se, but to deal with these guys as they came back from Afghanistan, because a lot of Arab governments did not want them coming home because they realized that these are the troublemakers that they'd shipped out. But you'll notice in the US press and the British press, there is a constant harping on about Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda militarily was irrelevant in Iraq since 2006. They had been defeated by the Iraqis. The Iraqis didn't want them there. And the same situation applies to some extent in Afghanistan. The Afghans, and to a certain element, the Taliban, not so thrilled that there are these foreign fighters, and there aren't a lot of them. I've seen various numbers. I've never been able to verify them, but you might say less than 1 or 2% of the Taliban are foreigners. If some element might be Al-Qaeda. I mean, the Al-Qaeda threat has been dramatically overblown. It has been dramatically overblown because it's like a boogeyman now. Whenever the Americans say Al-Qaeda on CNN, everybody panics south of the border.
I don't know, but it's taken seriously by a lot of people there. From the time I was there in Kandahar and had these conversations, I interviewed a guy who was on the Taliban Central Council and left it after 9/11. He said what had happened is that there had been a kind of merger between Mullah Omar and Al-Qaeda. That most of the Taliban didn't really even know about it, but they knew about it, but they weren't in on it. Apparently Omar lived in a compound not far from bin Laden's compound, and bin Laden used to give beautiful white SUVs to the leadership around Omar. And an interesting side story is apparently one morning, about 2.5 weeks after 9/11, about 30 or 40 beautiful white SUVs left Kandahar about 6:30 in the morning. It was Omar and bin Laden driving to the hills. And I won't speculate why nothing was done to that caravan. It's an interesting question. As far as I understand it, people take, however big that Al-Qaeda presence is, seriously. But I don't know if anybody really knows. I mean, I suppose the Pakistani ISI knows, but I don't know how much they're telling anyone.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with Paul, and I think Al-Qaeda is present, and I think the fact that bin Laden hasn't been caught, I think does go to show that they have support. And you know, the foreign fighters are not just the Arabs; there are Chechens in there. There are other Central Asians there. So there is a reasonable presence. I wouldn't say it's a hugely significant one, but they are there, and they do cause mayhem. I mean, much of the suicide bombing also involves many of these people because they are the ideological ones. Mm-hmm. Within the Taliban, I would say many of them are opportunists. They are not. They aren't ideologically driven as, for instance, the Al-Qaeda.
I mean, one thing I learned when I was in Afghanistan is the traditional Islam in Afghanistan, and if there's any Afghans here, they can correct me. My understanding of it was a very Afghan Islam. The mosque was not the center of religious activity. The shrine was. The shrine was a very populous place. Everybody would come and go, and you could sit around and meditate or pray. It was not run by imams there was not a strict hierarchical dictate from the clergy. They were there, but they were part of the milieu around the shrine. This kind of more Talibanized Sharia-style hierarchy of Islam came with Wahhabism, which came to a large extent because of Saudi money, Pakistani ISI involvement, and the development of the Taliban. The Taliban, if I understand it correctly, brought quite a different kind of Islam to Afghanistan, which was not native to it. But to understand something about the mystique of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, there's a scene in our film where we visit Al-Qaeda graves in Kandahar, and there's about 24 Al-Qaeda bodies have been buried there. And they're being guarded by, at the time, some soldiers that I think worked for Wali Karzai, who was sort of one of the Karzai's brother, tribal leader in Kandahar. And there's salt at the top of the head of each of these graves. And people were coming from not only all over Afghanistan, even from Pakistan, to come to the grave, because if you would taste the salt, you could make a prayer, and your prayer would be, if it had to do with the health of someone, would be answered. So while we were there, an old woman came off. She just bust in from Karachi, and she had heard that a boy who was blind had been cured this way. So she came so she could touch the salt and cure her grandson of blindness. So we asked some of the soldiers there, why does Al-Qaeda have this significance? And the answer was for two reasons. One is because they were Arabs, and Arabs who are martyred sit closer to Allah in heaven than non-Arabs. So and number two, because they were martyred outside their own country. They'd come to Afghanistan and died in some sense for the Afghan people, even though most of these Al-Qaedas that were killed were actually killed by Afghans in the post 9/11 fighting. Still, there was this mystique about it all. So Al-Qaeda has this ideological role to play, which to a large extent was an extension of Wahhabism from Saudi Arabia, and if you want to take it all the way back, go back to Roosevelt's meeting with Ibn Saud in 1945, where the US decides to make an alliance with the Saudi royal family to spread Wahhabism throughout the entire region, to use Islamic extremism as an ally in US foreign policy.
There are times when reality just asserts itself, in spite of the haze created by television news and entertainment. Sometimes crisis rips a tear in the fabric of myth and propaganda. Now a profound economic crisis has ripped asunder the American dream itself. Millions of people losing jobs and homes. They lack proper health care and any real sense of security. Since 2001, workers' wages have fallen or remained stagnant, even though worker productivity has risen almost 33%. By 2006, the top 1% of households were receiving 23% of all pre-tax income, more than double what it was in the 1970s. It's the greatest concentration of income since 1928. As unemployment rises, we need to know why this crisis is happening and what we can do to defend ourselves. Why are wages so low? Why is the society so laden with debt? Is it in ordinary Americans' interest to have a $1 trillion military budget to project power across the globe? Corporate television news won't ask these questions, let alone try to find answers. Only a truly independent news network can tackle these questions with courage and with ordinary people's interests in mind. We need a news network that's independent of corporations, governments, and political parties. We need the real news, but there won't be a real news network unless we raise substantial funds right away. The current financial crisis has hit our funding hard. Together, we do have the power to turn it around. There are already hundreds of thousands of people watching the real news every month. If everyone pitches in, we can build an internet and cable television network that will change the face of media forever. You can organize house parties, talk to friends at school and at work, send email blasts and spread the word. Distribute this video to everyone you know. Pick up the phone and call a few friends and suggest they visit therealnews.com. Invest just 10 minutes a day to ask friends and colleagues to join the campaign to create a truly independent source of internet and television news. Together, we can build this network. Just 50,000 people at $10 a month gets us to our first level of sustainability. You can help us reach this goal, and when we do, we'll move to television in millions of homes across North America. Help us reach an audience in the millions. Please contribute generously. Spread the word. Let's make the Real News television network a reality.
Your tax-deductible donation makes it possible. Please contribute at therealnews.com.